Alright, this is turn 21 of Degeneracy, and I lose quite a lot. So I lose this province right over here. There wasn't very much there, it's just a little bit of province defense and my free spawn dispossessed spirits, which I didn't move out since I didn't have anyone on hand. This is a cave province, so this is actually a pretty decent province to fight in, but I don't really have anyone to do the fighting. And then Jomon's army here features a lot of these Tengus. And because he has them set to attack right away, they're just going to jump in and do some fighting on their own when there's really no need for them to do that. So he ends up losing a couple of those guys and the rest of them retreat. So basically just a couple unnecessary losses here from him, but otherwise it's just a big army taking on province defense. In Agartha, I forgot to move my army out of the way, so this is just kind of a dumb decision in that I didn't either abandon the crossbowmen and move the rest into the sea, and nor did I move my guys into the other adjacent Agarthan province which they could have potentially fought for. He has a priest to do some banishment and a bunch of crossbows, so they shoot at my own crossbowmen, and then his mages are just casting dust to dust on my undead guys, so those guys are just kind of popping while the archers are getting destroyed by superior firepower. And then, because these guys were set to hold and attack, the skeletons are kind of moving around them and helping get into the fight at the same time as the regular infantry. And yeah, he loses a couple of his guys due to friendly fire since it is a cave, so his crossbowmen have reduced accuracy, but not a huge number of losses, just 2 light crossbows it looks like. And then a couple of these guys just got injured, and I lose everything here because I didn't have a province to retreat to. Here in Dampdale, I actually defend this province. This is most likely just on account of the province defense being able to trigger a rout, probably by damaging this guy. We'll see what happens. So this is just province defense, taking some crossbow shots. Oh, you know what? It's most likely actually the fear aura from my Centurion. That would make sense. Yeah, so it looks like he is able to run past my guys after the Indies retreat, and then his fear aura is able to trigger a rout, and because they're at the very far end of the province, his guys make it off of the screen before my Centurion does, so even though both sides rout, his side escapes first. He takes very few losses, but I do manage to hold on to the province. Here in Peskin, this was my stealthy raiding party, with just some dispossessed spirits to take hits, while the acolyte summons up some skeletons. And it works out pretty well. The dispossessed spirits do die because they have only 1 HP, and being ethereal isn't a perfect protection. So yeah, we take some losses there, but the skeletons are able to overrun the province defense relatively easily. And yeah, so I lose 16 of those guys, but I still have enough in order to just take a couple crossbow shots early, and I can continue using that guy as a stealthy raider. Here in Goloriep, this is just his guys continuing to march on unopposed, so just a big blob of sacreds and a couple ice warriors. And then here, I similarly am able to raid a province without much defense. Here I lose a regular commander who had just been running around to collect guys, and here I run into or my Lemur Centurion, who was actually trying to move guys around, does run into these guys. That's kind of a weird formation on his part, in that the skeletons are just running up the middle and the crossbowmen are on the flanks, so it seems like it should be fairly easy to exploit. But he has way more guys than I do, so nothing really goes wrong there. I lose the Lemur Centurion, who had been leading this army here in Agartha. So that's the guy who retreated. So the Silver Sarcophagus has opened, so that's going to release a Divine Mummy, so that's kind of just like a bad attack. Here I get a lot of money and a barrel of air, so that's cool if I need to take crossbowmen underwater or some such, and of course I get some extra gems, so very nice. Here I get a few more extra gems, and here I get another bad event, which is just a large indie attack. So the Divine Mummy's not too scary. I can potentially bring over Grand Lemurs to spam Apostasy at it if I want to keep it, but I can also just kill it without too much trouble. This is going to be a little bit more difficult, just because it's... oops, wrong fight. It's a bunch of heavy infantry with some mage support, and while the mage AI isn't anything too impressive, it is just something that I do have to worry about. Yeah, so he might summon imps if I bring enough to trigger gem spending, and then this F3 guy can, yeah, just be annoying. And then, yeah, just a bunch of infantry, and I'll also have to deal with some skelly spam. But in good news, I did at least finish a fortress over here, so I'll be getting more free spawn, and my lizard shamans there are a little bit better protected. So in order to retake those provinces, I'm going to have this guy just bring his army in that was fighting Marignan. Oh, actually, this is really interesting. So the army here that had retreated because of the Limmer Centurion in the province defense doesn't actually have a retreat path. So that army from Marignan is actually gone, so that's actually a huge deal. So he actually just got really unlucky there, and yeah, he just loses a lot. So Marignan's down to, what, 4 provinces now, and 2 of which are forts. He does have a large army here, and I can even just let him have to deal with retaking this province with its infantry and so on. It's not a difficult province for him to take, given how many crossbows he has, but it's still kind of funny that, you know, he has to deal with that when it was very poorly defended from what I had there. So instead, I'm just going to retake this Divine Mummy province and be happy at Marignan's losses. But I am going to have to deal with these 2 guys. So I'm going to pull my Pretender back so that she can continue site searching up in here. But I am going to bring over a large number of guys here to deal with Jomon's army. So I have a bunch of mages here, with a small communion here from some of my Limmer acolytes, just in order to boost up the Grand Limmer by 1 so that he can cast Power of the Shadelands. So that's going to give all of my undead additional attack and AP. My formation here is fairly straightforward. I'm just using these guys here as arrow lures and so on so they can draw the initial aggro. I'm going to be spamming Frighten out of my Ravenant and Horde of Skeletons here in the core, along with this mercenary group, and then I have large lines of spectral velites. The reason that you use line formation here is basically just to extend the area that they're covering so that they can go further around the side and basically just envelop Jomon's army. So I expect that I have more than enough here to beat what he has, and then I also have the advantage of both fear auras backed up by Frighten spam, so I should be able to get rid of some of his troops that way, and I'll also be able to spam Apostasy at him to potentially convert a couple of his sacred troops to myself. And I also have some cold auras here from my Winter Wolves, which are set up here to attack rear, so they're going to basically run behind this small group of shadows there, and then potentially freeze some of his troops. Meanwhile, my little raiding party right over here is going to try to take this Jomonese province. The reason that I'm hitting this one is just that he has a commander there. I'm hoping that he's building a fort and I can cause some more economic damage by attacking into it with my skeleton spam. Given that Agarthan doesn't have troops of his own in this area, I don't expect that he'll be able to hit these provinces very easily, unless he wants to use his Servant of the Oracles or some such. But Servant of the Oracles isn't really a mage that Agarthan recruits primarily for combat over just doing utility magic and potentially site searching if it's an astral random. And then Jomon, of course, doesn't have any forces in this area, so it's going to be just province defense. So I expect that I'll be able to take this and potentially do some more raiding around this area with that skeleton spammer. Meanwhile, this army right over here is the crossbow and ghost blob that had been sitting right over here. And then I'm going to send it into Agartha's territory, and this actually does have the potential to go wrong if he's able to bring up a whole bunch of troops here, since I know that he has a fort over here, and additional reinforcements could potentially be back there. He can actually cut off this army and then also cut its retreat, so this is definitely a risky move, but I am expecting to be able to cause more damage if I'm able to succeed in my attack over here, since I'll then be in Agartha's backline, so I can do more deep raiding and potentially lock down some of his forts. Micklin, at least, is not attacking me actively yet. I think that he just has this army here in order to build a fort over it, so until that fort finishes, I can at least expect to be relatively safe from him, but I do need to be able to fend off these armies right over here, and also find a way to continue causing damage to Agartha. Alright, this is turn 22. It looks like Agartha has not cut me off, but I do run into him, and I do lose this fight. And this is mostly just a matter of him having mage support while I don't. So my crossbow formation is still set up in this skirmish formation while his aren't, and I still have my core of troops right over here. So you can see that his crossbows are set to fire archers, and mine are as well. And it looks like he's also adopted a skirmish formation here on both the top and the bottom. So both of us are basically just shooting into each other's archer lines with many of those hits going wide. But you can see here that he both has more crossbows and that his front line is just a fair bit larger than mine. These iron corpses right over here have very low magic resist, so they're facing up against the ghosts and they're not doing very well. So this actually does benefit me from a formation perspective, and my meteorite guards, which are just, you know, generic heavy infantry, are just fighting his heavy infantry. And then he's using Sermon of Courage, which is going to help keep his infantry in the fight, whereas these guys are mindless, so they don't need to worry about fear auras at all. My Lemur Centaurians are running up right over there. And then he has his own additional skeletons running in through the center right over here. They're behind his troops, though, so his regular infantry are actually doing the brunt of the fighting for now, while his ghosts are basically just waiting behind, or while his battle summons are just waiting behind them. These guys, because of their extremely heavy protection, are actually able to tank the meteorite guards fairly well. And blind fighters also have fairly good stats, so they're able to avoid some of the attacks from these guys. He's still just using raised skeletons instead of dust to dust, which is working in my favor, but just his having way more stuff here means that his front line is able to cut through mine eventually. And while my ghosts are ethereal, the lack of protection means that the multiple attacks from the iron corpses are eventually able to cut through them. And he still has more crossbows, or it looks like we actually have a similar number of crossbows left alive. He just has a front line that's more survivable and is being replaced by these ghosts right over here. So with my front line fallen, it's now just a bunch of crossbows in skirmish formation, and naturally they're not going to be doing, they're not going to be very effective in melee, and they also have low morale, so they're going to rout once enough of them take some damage. Because my meteorite guard is very slow, it looks like he dies while retreating. It's interesting that the battle report here doesn't quite match up perfectly, since it looks like he had some iron corpses still alive at the end. Replay bugs are relatively common, but yeah, given that he just had more stuff than I did and had more mage support to enforce it, or to reinforce it, I do lose pretty much all of my front line, so all of my ghosts and the and all the Centaurians which had been placed into combat. I do manage to keep a fair number of my crossbows alive and cause some damage to his guys as well, but it's definitely a victory for him, just because while he did lose more troops in total, he can also replace them a bit more easily. Here in the Old Land, this is just my guys continuing to fall back against his, and with all these magic weapons, sacreds, the Ghost Province defense isn't good, or the Ghosts in Province defense aren't going to do a whole lot. Here in Ard, Marignan moves out with his entire giant army here, so we can just take a look at that. And I did have a little bit of province defense set up over here, but definitely nothing like the big investment that I had. So these guys are set in a spread line formation, and these guys are set to guard this guy. So he's definitely relying on his firepower in both his archers and crossbows, and his mage support to do the killing for him. Rather than relying on his infantry, which are basically just here to soak crossbows. And with his one pearl thing, potentially power the spheres into an air elemental summoning from all these guys. Yeah, it's probably something along those lines. And then just some basic evocation from him. So he might be doing full-size fire elementals from these guys, or he might just be doing more of the smaller fire elementals again, just because he has more than enough gems to do just the one fire elemental summon, and given that he gave them a pearl, it's very likely to be another power of the spheres cast. So Marignon's just kind of moving out with everything there. I'm able to take on the Divine Mummy without any trouble. It does have relatively high MR, but it's just one guy with one attack, so no real trouble there. And I just have a lot of dudes, so he runs up. It looks like he's just hitting these guys and not actually killing them. With his one attack that isn't even a magic attack, he's very unlikely to kill any of my ghosts. And yeah, he gets chopped up pretty quickly. Here in Griffa, it looks like Ulm hits Agarthan? That's weird. Oh, this is probably just a mistake. So Agartha is actually invading Abyssia now, which explains why he hasn't been pushing his advantage onto me. And because Abyssia had been invading Ulm, Ulm is fighting back with these sneaky raiding parties. I'm guessing that this was actually an accident, that he was trying to fight an Agarthan province which he saw had low province defense, but instead he hits... Actually, it looks like Abyssia has province defense here. That's just kind of weird. Or Agartha has province defense here, rather. It's possible that he added on some province defense after Ulm had scouted it, because that's kind of too few guys to send into a fair amount of PD. And then the Servant of the Oracles doesn't do a whole lot, but he adds a couple skeletons to make life a little bit more difficult. Here I'm able to successfully raid this province, as expected. I do lose the dispossessed spirits, which I had brought on as chaff, but that's why you bring them, so that they can die, so that your skeletons can live. Because this is a lizard province, it actually has some very threatening guys here, but I'm able to summon up a bunch of these skeletons here, which are eventually able to cut through them, and because his guys have morale and mine don't, his are eventually going to rout once they remain in combat for long enough. The Raise Dead spell summons up the Soulless instead of the Long Dead, of course, and while these guys have much worse attack and defense and so on, they do have more hit points, so they're able to stay in the fight at least a little bit longer, and eventually do enough damage to get rid of the morale-suffering human units, or living units, I should say. So I'm able to take on that province, but it is surprisingly close. Here I find another treasure. This is awesome. I find yet more gold, get yet more gems, and I hired a mercenary company successfully right over here. I'm not going to do any fighting with these guys quite yet. I had province defense over here for some reason. It might have even been from an event, or from when I was trying to, or if I thought I was like trying to bait out an attack. But I'm not going to reinforce this quite yet, because I want to attack Jomon instead, and I can only really do one of these at a time. This army is much more threatening because of its magical weapons, so even with a bunch of living archers on my side, I'm not really expecting to win that, so I want to be able to hold off for now and then try to get additional mage support from over here, try to bring additional troops, namely all these crossbowmen from over here, and then I can potentially hold one of these provinces instead. Given that I'm building a fortress right over here, I definitely do want to be able to protect this province, so I'm going to be moving this guy back up over here, and then I can bring him down south with additional reinforcements and then potentially hold this against Atlantis. Meanwhile, I see that Jomon's army has pulled back, so I'm going to rush in after them. Because this province is in friendly dominion, I'm not actually risking these Grand Limbers, or this Grand Limber, because even if he dies, he'll be able to respawn in my capital. And I also just expect that my army is strong enough to be able to beat his. The same is not true for this province right over here, so I'm just calling shadows right over here just to prevent him from being able to insta-breach it. Meanwhile, I'm moving these guys up over into here, in order to work with this province defense which I'd already purchased, and basically my plan is to rely on that to provide a front line, and then use my additional crossbows to just try to cause as much damage to Marignon's army as possible. I don't necessarily expect to be able to beat it, given that he's got, mage support and more firepower than I do, but I can at least cause more damage to him, and given that he's already a relatively weak nation, just by being reduced to this much, I can basically keep him down for longer, so that I don't have to worry about him counterattacking me quite as fiercely. Given that Agartha is actually pushing into Abyssia right over here, I also don't expect him to be able to, or to want to commit more than he has to in order to fight me, so I'm going to be keeping these forts, or I can don't necessarily expect these forts to be attacked, given that he would then need to siege them down, have starving troops, and so on. So as far as I understand it, with my encouragement, Abyssia's plan at this point is to try to use me as a sink, so to speak, where my other neighbors need to spend resources killing me, while he's able to grow unmolested. Given that he's one of the larger nations at this point, and is likely to grow even larger by fighting Abyssia over here and taking some living and therefore valuable land, he's going to be able to continue to grow while other nations are spending their resources fighting me. Meanwhile, if he wanted to fight me at this point, he can do so over here. He can do so where I'm fighting Marignon already, or he can do so by attacking these forts. And while he could move over those forts, he'd still need to maintain a sieging force right over here, which basically leaves him vulnerable to continued harassment. So he's going to try to basically limit what he focuses on fighting me for now. Basically just try to keep these provinces, which he's already taken under his control, without devoting the resources required to actually kill me. And then, given that everyone else is going to be fighting me, everyone else will need to continue spending gold gems and resources, gold gems and so on, and mage turns, of course, to actually fight me. Well, he's going to be free to scale up. And given that he's a very defensive player, he's happy for me to cause damage to other people as long as I myself don't grow out of control. So that's the plan right over there, and why, even though it's essentially a 4v1 at this point, I'm really not fighting all 4 players at the same time. And this is turn 23, so in this first battle, Marignon actually loses, so he doesn't send enough to actually fight both the large amount of province defense that I'd already built up there, and the large number of crossbows that I move in to reinforce it. And you can see right over here, while these guys do have fairly decent protection, they definitely don't have enough to tank the armor-piercing shots from the crossbows. The archers themselves, of course, are relatively lightly armored, so they take a fair amount of damage from the crossbows as well. And because I have all this province defense right over here, I've got guys to soak the arrow shots and soak the evocation from the one mage that he brought with. And even after his army's routed, because this guy spent a bunch of his fatigue on spells, he's actually stuck standing there for a round while his troops run past him, and then he gets shot to death as well. Here in Namur, he's taking on this province right over here, which just really didn't have much, so his guys have no trouble whatsoever. Here in Pantocrator's bounty, Atlantis continues his advance, and I'm really going to need to do something about that. And here in the chambers underneath, I'm able to push into Jomon's province defense without any trouble. I do lose some of those dispossessed spirits, but they are fundamentally sacrificial, so I'm not worried about that whatsoever. And the formation works pretty well in getting my guys spread out along the sides. They do cluster forward towards the center in this case just because there are no flanking enemies. And many of the losses against my dispossessed spirits are just the javelins from my infantry flying at them. And the Winter Wolves have very high AP, so they're kind of like cavalry in that they're able to rush up the sides. So against an actual opponent, they hopefully should be joining in at the same time as my ghosts. Here in Hexwoods, I get additional unrest, which is a little unfortunate, but that just costs me a little bit of gold, but I get some more back. And I get the Star of Heroes, which is nice if I ever want to go for thugging of my own. My evocation is kind of working my way up. I still don't have the good stuff in Evocation 5, namely Shadow Blast, or the Nether Bolts from Evocation 4, but I at least have a little bit of something, and I could potentially even magic duel some of Marignon's S1 guys while in my Dominion with my Grand Lemurs if we get up there. So, given that I don't have a fortress finished over here, I'm going to cluster up my troops onto here. So I'm using my mercenaries behind a front line of my dispossessed spirits. These guys are the ones which I'm going to get rid of first, and they're going to potentially paralyze some of his guys, and just potentially cause a little bit of damage while taking up some of their fatigue, but they'll get chopped through very quickly. However, I then have my actual guys running in behind them. So my mercenaries over here and my toad guys right over here. Then I have my spectral guys looping in on the sides. So again, having them in a line formation on the flanks means that I can extend my battle line out past the edge of the deployment zone, whereas the center is going to be filled with skeletons, and then these guys are going to walk up hopefully behind the skeletons in order to chuck their javelins and eventually get into the fights if the skeletons get cleared out as well. These guys at the back are going to be spamming apostasy, or being communion slaves. Let me see. Yeah, so it looks like, oh no, those are just the regular commanders. Yes, they're just spamming apostasy, or just staying at the back in order to remain alive so that the troops are going to be able to keep fighting. And then this guy's going to be able to spam terror, so that's like Frighten, but in a larger area of effect, and has a better chance of actually getting the squads to rout. So with these guys, I'm hopefully going to be able to get rid of his attack if he goes onto here. On this province, I still have most of my guys researching, site searching, and so on, but I have a couple of my guys set to patrol, namely these four right over here. they're going to be just spamming out starfires and then set to retreat. The idea being that they can cause some armor negating damage, and this spell doesn't have a magic resistance check or anything. So this is just basically like adding additional crossbows, you could say, in that it's going to be doing some damage to his heavy infantry. And then meanwhile, these guys are coming up with a real army to move and patrol. So in addition to the small amount of province defense, which includes some ghostly frontliners, I'm also going to have a bunch of crossbows and additional ghosts set up to reinforce them. So between the crossbows set up to fire closest, which are going to land into his sacreds, and the starfires from my mages, I should be able to cause enough damage in order for my ghosts to tank for a bit. And because these guys are set to retreat after shooting off their starfires, I'm not expecting to actually lose any mages in this fight, even if I do lose, and I should hopefully be able to cause a fair amount of damage to them in the process, enough that I should be able to lift the siege with the army right up over here, just in case I'm wrong. Meanwhile, right over here, I am going to be attacking into his army right over here, and I move the mercenaries up so that they can take the initial fire, just because I don't plan on rebidding them. And I can potentially save myself some money by doing that in case the mercenaries all die. I should have once again sent out a little ghostly raiding party right over here in order to basically ping that province. But at this point I'm basically just avoiding fighting Agartha and being happy that he's still avoiding fighting me. I'm also still drawing income from this province over here. I have these guys set to just patrol instead of moving out to hit another province. The idea being that because he lost with this army right over here, that I was hoping that he just had lost enough stuff that I could potentially still win just by virtue of having a decent setup. This was kind of silly. I should have actually tried to extract, either going through Agartha to cause some damage through him, or but it's trying to raid Marignon up into here. But I figured that my best bet for causing as much damage as possible is by fighting with my crossbows and the province defense together, and that if I hit up this province right over here, then I run the risk of running into Marignon moving up to reinforce. So I would basically be splitting my forces at that point, and similarly, if he reinforces into here and also attacks this province back here at the same time, then I would basically just have less firepower all in one place, and by reducing the concentration of my forces, I would be reducing the damage that I do to his army in the process. So that's probably what I was thinking, but it probably wasn't the best bet to actually stay there. Meanwhile, Agartha's moved up a bunch of guys right over here, so he's definitely planning on claiming these provinces, which had once been Jomon's. So again, just trying to, he seems to be trying to minimize the risks that he's taking, while still getting stuff out of fighting me. And that's the turn. This is turn 24, and we get some battles that finally go in our favor. So my big blob of troops with some mage support runs into Jomon's army, and he actually brought some mage support as well, but they do manage to kill his pretender along with a huge number of his guys. So let's go ahead and check out this fight. So the first thing worth noting is that I just have more stuff. Like, I have a huge number of ghosts, and his own line is relatively small. Additionally, his formation doesn't seem to be particularly good in that he's got basically just this one line formation of guys with Yaris set up alongside the front right over here. So his guys aren't all fighting at the same time. And then he's holding basically back these guys over here, which he would want set up a little bit further forward and potentially on the sides in order to draw evocation. And again, just trying to hit it at the same time with all of his forces. So I've got my skeletons coming up right over here, and they're at the behind this relatively thin line right over here. His Tengu fly in, of course, ahead of his army as they had in the past, and they're going to be fighting these Burgmeister guards, the few skeletons that have trickled through, and these guys over here which are running alongside the flank. Meanwhile, some of his cavalry here are paralyzed, some are fighting the dispossessed spirits, and some are fighting this large wall of undead on their own. So while he does have some archery shooting overhead and some flying shards of all spells coming through, for the most part, my troops are better concentrated than his, so I'm actually able to start basically surrounding and doing a lot of damage to his guys, while most of his guys are still not yet in the fight. The longbows are doing a little bit of damage just because my guys have no protection, but because they have excellent shields and are ethereal, many of them are able to avoid the longbow damage entirely. The samurai cavalry are able to survive relatively long because of the very high defense, and their morale is, or their magic resistance is at least the human standards. They're able to avoid some of the attacks, but they are eventually getting cut down. Meanwhile, most of my losses right over here so far have been those skeletons, so I don't need to worry about those at all. And then, as can be expected, the undead kill very slowly, but because they're ethereal and able to avoid at least some of the attacks, they also don't die particularly quickly either. He finally is at least fully committed, so his line has actually caught up with mine, and now all of his guys are fighting at once. But my line is a little bit further spread than his, so I'm able to wrap around him and therefore get a larger surface area fighting him. And as I mentioned earlier, I just have more stuff, so I have more guys behind. And when we're all wrapped up like this, I have the advantage of these auras, so both the cold auras from my winter wolves and the fear auras from this guy right up over here to potentially cause some fear amongst his guys as well. Most of these shadows right over here are simply paralyzing his guys rather than dealing damage, but they are able to keep some of them out of the fight. Over here you can see that his line of Ashigaru's all routed at once. So that's awesome. It means that he loses a lot of his density because that was a lot of what was holding it up, holding up his line. So I'll have yet more guys attacking into isolated squares of guys. So this ogre's on his own, so he's getting hit more. And then similarly, I'll able to have my guys continue to loop around and then get into the mix with his guys over here. Interestingly, they cast the Berserk buff on a crossbowman, so he's no longer shooting, he's just running into melee. And his line, because it collapsed the flanks right over here, is causing yet more of my ghosts to loop around and make the fight even more in my favor here towards the center. His Earth Snake is almost completely surrounded right over here, and it's getting a fair amount of fatigue because it's fighting in severe cold, and it's cold-blooded, which means that it's going to be fatiguing out relatively quickly. So if his army doesn't rout, then his Earth Snake is going to basically just be unconscious and surrounded by guys who are have a cold aura to basically keep it unconscious when it should be waking up from being past 100 fatigue. Additionally, its higher fatigue is going to make it have a higher chance of taking critical hits, which means that even with its high protection, it stands a decent chance of actually taking damage. So it's got an ever-healing wound already, and now it is completely surrounded. So while its extremely high protection and high base HP means that it's going to take a while to go down, its growing fatigue is leaving it more and more vulnerable, and its single non-magical attack is very bad at actually killing ghosts. Meanwhile, my Winter Wolves, because of their high AP, are able to get into the mix right up here and engage the archers, so now these guys are starting to get cut down, and similarly the Winter Wolves up there are engaging that squad of archers. So it's a little bit unfortunate that I have my Winter Wolves stuck in like this because they're very valuable troops, but his armies are routed, and his Earth Snake is surrounded so it actually can't escape. So with it being routed, its attack and defense are particularly low, and it looks like it might even have been paralyzed as well. So that sets its attack and defense to 0, and it is eventually killed. So I'm able to kill Jomon's Pretender there. I'm able to cause a large amount of damage to him, and while some of his guys did rout, I'm able to get rid of his most valuable troops, including his Tengus, his Samurais, and his Samurai Cavalry. Most of the guys that escaped are these very basic, low-cost chaff units, and many of his archers. And of course he loses the Pretender, which is a huge deal. Most of my losses are the easily replaced dispossessed spirits and the Shadow Soldiers, although I do lose a couple of my more valuable Spectral units and my Winter Wolves as well. And it seems that I should have rebid those Burgmeister Guards, because I could have still used those very fighty Hoburgs. Here in the Silent Wetlands, Jomon attacked me with a single commander. He might have thought that I had no province defense there, or it might have just been a mistake, but yeah, I definitely take that province. And then here, I'm able to successfully catch and beat Atlantis' army, but at a huge loss of ghostly troops. So we'll go ahead and watch this fight as well. And basically, the reason that I take such heavy losses here is not a matter of him having an excellent formation or anything, but just a matter of my guys being really bad against his against Atlantis' troops in general. So these guys have high magic resistance, very high morale, good attack stats, and most importantly, magic weapons. So I'm spamming Apostasy and Frighten at him in order to try to steal some of these guys, but they don't care about the ethereal nature of these guys, and their attack and defense are sufficiently better that they're going to be hitting very frequently. So the crossbows are doing work. You can definitely see that here, and as are the Spectral Javelins, because these guys don't have shields. So these guys at least are getting whittled down by my magic as they're approaching. There's some friendly fire from the javelins as well, but they're just hitting dispossessed spirits for now. Now I have my fear guys up in the fight, so that's a little bit unfortunate as far as positioning goes, because I would much prefer them to be a little bit further back, but that's okay. And they're at least spreading disease amongst his troops as well. The disease isn't really doing anything in this particular fight, just given that they're already in it and disease needs several turns to work. But we're still at least getting a surround going here, so we can wrap around his guys and do a little bit of extra damage at the edges. My mercenaries are fighting him and hitting him with non-magic attacks, but they're just statistically not nearly as good as his awesome sacreds. Luckily, the fear auras and damage dealt to these guys here does its work, so his ice guards are now routing. Or his ice warriors are now routing, rather. So that's awesome. But his sacreds, because of their very high morale, are staying stuck in, and the banishment spam that's landing on my troops is causing a large amount of damage to them as well. And you can see here they're just incredibly killy against my ghosts. They just chop right through them. So my ghosts are chasing his guys out, which is pretty nice. And his banishment is landing at least largely on skeletons for now, so those guys are dying instead of my permanent troops. But his sacreds are just still holding up very well, probably on account of their decent magic resistance and amazing stats, and the fact that their weapons are actually fairly long. So while they can't repel my spears, they're also not subject to being repelled themselves. These guys are still chasing that routing squad, so they're just following them away from the fight. And that's potentially good because it means that they're going to stand a chance of running into Atlantis' commanders, these guys right over here. So this is his Tungalik, the mage, and this is his prophet, so both potentially very valuable guys to get rid of. So you can see here that just in the troop versus troop fight, his sacreds are just so vastly superior to my ghosts that they just kill everything. Part of which is at least caused because of these guys just running away and not being part of the same fight. But I at least have my replenishing front line of undead to continue doing damage to the sacreds, while the ghosts which chase these guys off are now behind his commanders. So with a combination of the banishment and just the very killy sacreds, they're definitely getting rid of these undead very quickly. But I've now gotten rid of his commanders, and now that his armies are routed, they're pulling back away, and even with the penalty, the attack and defense penalty from routing, and in this case, this guy's already got a bunch of afflictions piled up, their attack and defense scores are excellent. With the Earth Bless that they had, that partial Earth Bless, their fatigue isn't actually all that high, even in spite of their encumbrance. And because they're regenerating, they're actually coming back from many of the minor hits that they're getting. So this is why the rest of the ghosts die. Because even though they catch them while they're routing, and these guys are caught from the other side over here, these guys are still able to cut through the ghosts when they're making their escape. So yeah, those were just some very nasty troops to fight. When fighting him, what I could have done better is tried to bring in more crossbows and additional province defense and that sort of thing, but really I just did get at least a little bit lucky in routing his ice warriors quickly and then catching his commanders, and then the fact that the Acerdotes were surrounded did increase the attrition that they took, so they have additional sacreds which retreat, or they have additional sacred casualties in addition to the ones that retreated. So while I lose more stuff there, mine is at least more easily replaceable, and I can now start taking back some of those provinces that Atlantis took. Because I was able to kill both of his commanders, he is not able to extract those living sacreds into ice warriors immediately, so I can actually follow him in with the troops that I had brought into the other fort. Here I do lose the fight, but I do cause more damage than I actually take, so that's always really good. A large part of this is just a matter of the formations. So you can see right here that his spread line right over here is at least doing a good job of not eating all the crossbows at once. But the fact that these guys are bunched up means that they're not actually helping to fight, while his air elementals and so on get in. His flaming arrows are actually increasing the effectiveness of his crossbow shots by a fair bit, but most of his crossbow shots aren't even hitting because they're shooting at that one squad in skirmish formation. Meanwhile, because he had that spread formation right over there, his guys rout very quickly. And then because my guys are set to fire archers, and his mages are mixed in with the archers, they are actually eating some attacks of their own. or eating some crossbow shots of their own. This is seems to have a battle replay bug in that it doesn't quite match up with the losses that he's shown. So it looks much worse than it actually ended up being with the turn. But basically what happened in the actual fight, at a guess, is just that the guys set to fire archers were able to shoot a bunch of his mages, so he is able to take a bunch of losses there. So even more shots landing amongst his mages than we saw in the battle replay there. So while he does actually manage to take the province, and all these guys are dead because they had nowhere to retreat to, I do manage to kill some of these very expensive cap-only mages, and one of these guys as well, in addition to causing some attrition amongst his crossbows and city guards. So yeah, even losing 870 gold effectively, or no, almost 900 gold actually in effective value here from these guys, I'm able to cause almost as much damage back to him thanks to just his having his mages stuck in with the guys which my crossbows were set to shoot to. So I do lose both of the commanders there, so that's a little unfortunate. I get free bonus dominion, and I finish this fort right over here. So additional forts going up is nice. It means I'm going to be getting yet more ghosts spawning over time. With many of his guys having retreated into here, and mine not wanting to go that way to avoid fighting Agartha's forces for now, I'm actually going to go in right over here and try to follow Jomon's forces back out towards his forts, and potentially even take some of those forts for myself. Meanwhile, because I know that he has no commanders right over here, I can expect these guys to be unscripted, and I want to kill them before he has the chance to recruit an indie commander and extract them. So I'm bringing all of my crossbows, since those were the most effective guys. I'm still having this guy spam apostasy, so I can potentially take some of those sacreds for myself. And I know that his sacreds are going to be charging up the middle right over here, so I can potentially envelop them with my guys in this formation, with additional skeletons coming up the middle to help kill them. I am expecting to actually lose a bunch of ghosts again in this fight, just based on how amazingly strong those sacreds are, but without the bless, they're not going to be nearly as strong in either their stats, since they won't have that water bless, increasing their defense. They're not going to have regeneration, and they're not going to have reinvigoration, so they're going to tire out and suffer stat penalties. So while I'm still getting pushed in just based on, fighting so many enemies at once, the fact that I won those battles means I'm able to push back against some of these nations right over here, and the fact that Agartha is continuing to be focusing on this war over here instead of on killing me means that I'm able to basically be a little bit lazy over here and just keep these forts looking unattractive while using my actual forces to fight against Jomon and Atlantis instead. And that's the turn.